Yeah. So what's going to launch our conversation is an article from the Fraser Institute by a young lady named Ravina Baines. And the article is called Property Rights for All Canadians, the First Nations Issue Forgotten by All Federal Political Parties. And in it, she says, consider this fact. In Canada today, there are 3 groups of people who cannot legally own property. Children, the mentally incompetent, and First Nations people who live on a reserve. That's right. First Nations people in Canada who choose to live on a reserve are grouped in the same category as children. So how is this possible? Well, under the Indian Act, First Nations people do not own their own land. Instead, it's held for them by the government. Because of this policy, First Nations people who currently live on reserve do not enjoy the same property rights as every other Canadian. On-reserve members are unable to earn equity on their home, use it as collateral to borrow money, sell their land to whomever they choose, or bequest their wealth to their children. So, I mean, the first question, I'd like to clarify, or ask is, what is the Indian Act? The Indian Act is one of those things you remember learning about in middle school, and then basically it's all a blur from there. All you know is that things went really bad.
I mean, if that, how many people really remember it, right? You're sort of like you said, to some extent, I would argue we, at least from what I remember, it was like we paid it lip service. Like, you sort of knew about it. That was it, right? Like, the teacher sort of checked the box. Oh, okay, I taught this part of the curriculum. Done. I just say that because I think I've learned more either through, for example, like, this is so super random, but like working at Sport Check, I remember someone being like, "Oh, here's my card that gets me exempt from HST," and I'm like, "What? What is this? How do I get one of those?" Right? Like, so my point is like, the experience of what I learned in school, there's an Indian Act, and, it was a way to resolve conflict. Done. You know what I mean? Like, there's zero sort of comprehension. And plus, part of my point is like, are we teaching at the appropriate age that like we're actually informing kids in a manner that potentially could lead to change? And I would say probably not, because generally speaking, we're going to teach these things in a way that we don't want change. We want to say, well, whatever the government's, for the most part, government schooling is sort of like, the government did the best they could. Here's what it is. And nothing to talk about. Right? Mm-hmm. Like, it's not taught in a controversial way because, it is what it is. But anyways.
Yeah. So the Indian Act is a Canadian federal law that governs in matters pertaining to the Indian status, which we're going to talk about later, bans, and Indian reserves. Throughout history, it has been highly invasive and paternalistic, as it authorizes the Canadian federal government to regulate and administer in the affairs and day-to-day lives of registered Indians and reserve communities. The authority has ranged from overarching political control, such as imposing governing structures on Aboriginal communities in the form of band councils, to control over the rights of Indians to practice their culture and traditions. So the Indian Act has also enabled the government to determine the land base of these groups in the form of reserves, and even to define who qualifies as Indian in the form of Indian status. So,
it sounds like the government's deeply involved in what exactly these things are.
Yeah. But, I guess the simple solution, or we would just say, is, okay, well, why not, like, just looking at it face value, why not just let them be, give them their property? But then that poses a question of what the basis of our conversation will be about, is like, what is a property right? Like, how do you know something belongs to somebody? Because the government is kind of positioning themselves to be gracious and not misrepresenting the government. Like the government is positioning themselves in a way that, well, they're insinuating that this is their land. This is government land. This isn't Aboriginal land. Mm-hmm. And so, just to be fair, because part of it, usually, when you get into conversations about Indigenous issues, it's usually, we have to kind of say, the politically correct things or not ask certain questions. But the question, I want to ask is, okay, well, before we get into whose land is this, the land is yours. The land is yours. Anyways, what is a property right?
Yeah, that's it's such a deep question, and I mean, realistically, it's not. I think many people take that question for granted, right? And I mean, even let's say the current cultural affinity for socialism, right? I would suggest that majority of pro-socialist people don't even know, okay, well, what is property rights, and what would it mean to remove property rights? Right? What would it mean if there was no such thing as landowners? Yeah.
Okay. But first, how would you define what a property right is?
Well, yeah. So I just wanted to say, I just was trying to contextualize that it's an important question that I think we don't even talk about. For me, I think there's lots of philosophical stuff that you can get into on this question, but I think for me, the way that I don't want to say talk about it for the layman, but if I'm having a conversation with somebody who's never really engaged it, I think the starting point is think about yourself, right? Think about you, like you are the primary property of you, right? Like whatever, like my point is to say, let's start there when it comes to property rights, i.e. the idea of what's called self-ownership. Right. That to me, that's the starting place of the conversation, because it allows you to identify some pretty clear things. And, I don't want to call it elephant in the room, but sort of the clear counterexample is the idea of slavery. Right. Slavery is the removal of self-ownership. And so, I mean, I don't know. What is your take on that? I mean, I know we were going to go somewhere with it, but in terms of self-ownership and property rights, do you think that's a fair place to start? Do you think maybe that's even too nuanced?
I think what I would start with, how does one transfer their individual rights to a piece of property? So when we're looking at the Indigenous issue, and when I mean Indigenous, I'm not even saying specifically Canada, but just Indigenous, Aboriginal, meaning from the original people of a land. I think we have to ask, okay, well, the land that they're on, the resources, is it theirs? So does any human being own a natural resource? And I would say no. No human being owns a natural resource because the human being didn't create it.
Yeah, so I mean, what you're saying is in the natural state of things, nobody owns it. Now,
like nobody can own the ocean. Nobody owns the ocean.
I mean, like the ocean arguably is slightly more complicated, but I think you could apply the same thing to a forest.
Yeah, well, that's what I meant. Not ocean to forest, but yes, in general, like natural resources.
The reason I wanted to use a forest because it's a little bit easier to sort of hash out, what it looks like. There are people who, especially in the libertarian community, would say the reason why we have a pollution problem is because of nobody owns the water, or nobody owns ocean or portions of ocean. And I mean, obviously, I'm not trying to hash out the nuance there. If someone's listener goes, well, what about polluting? Yeah, okay. There's a long conversation there, so don't throw darts at me. But let's go to the forest example. Probably the simplest claim would be the idea of, before I get there, the funny thing I wanted to say is we would say, oh, nobody owns the natural resources, but then how do we define the government as owning it? It's sort of a oxymoron, or maybe oxymoron is not the right word, but to me, there's a level of like, well, no individual owns it, but okay, but the collective representation of the people own it. It's kind of like, what does that even mean? Like, to me, there's a bit of a logical contradiction there, or you're sort of just taking a step without making a sound argument. So, I think in general, if we're talking about the creation of property rights, there's this idea of what's called homesteading. And I think the simplest way of looking at it, or terminology that's ever used, is to say someone would begin to own the land when they homestead it, and homesteading requires mixing your labor with the land. So the example would be, you walk into the woods, you find a forest, and let's call it uninhabited for argument's sake, and then you cut down all the trees and start building a house on it. And realistically, this is how Canada settled. This is, we essentially had people coming from European countries, and the government basically said, you get to own the land if you build on it.
Yeah, but can I give some pushback to that, the idea, the concept, just to nuance it, because I've been doing some reading on John Locke and Lockean theory. John Locke being a 18th century political scientist / philosopher. You guys might remember learning about him in university or last year of high school. But Lockean theory is arguing that just because a person lives on the land doesn't mean they own it, because they didn't create the land. But what Locke argues is that one can transfer their rights to property by mixing their labor with the natural resource and creating something, i.e. creating a house. So if you created the house from the natural resource, then you own the house, but not the property. In general, like his body of work was, like most economists would, he's arguing that, the broader picture is, human beings, their responsibility is to use the resources most efficiently to promote, to help advance mankind. So that's what John Locke would argue, is that, and I would probably agree with him on that, that you would mix your labor with the natural resource and then create something new. So you're creating something new versus like, okay, well, I'm just bathing in this lake here, so I own the lake. I'm using these branches to keep me warm, so I'm using the tree. Well, no, you're not. You're just using up the resource.
And for the listener, you got to put this in like an 18th century context where, let's say, most land is uninhabited. Today, the means to which you would do that would be generally not uninhabited land. But if you think of your salary and wealth as stored labor, because essentially you've accumulated income from your labor, or entrepreneurial. So you've created, I would argue, that's stored labor that you've then traded for property. So I just wanted to, make sure that the listener is remembering the context to the Lockean argument. And yes, I think there's an easy way to sort of transition it to today where...
Hold on. But before we get there, I wanted to, I will put this in the show notes. So there's an article on fee. And the article was called "The Moral Foundations of Property Rights." And so in it, there's this interesting blurb in it, and maybe this will be helpful for the listeners to just think through what these options are when it comes to property rights and so forth, and especially original property rights. So it says, original claims to property are sometimes defended with a finder-keeper approach. According to this argument, the discoverer of, say, an oil field is its rightful owner. But if this approach applies to oil fields, it should also apply to the discovery of a continent, planet, or galaxy. Merely being the first to observe something or putting up the capital that leads to a discovery seems to be insufficient grounds for full private ownership. other claims to property are based on first occupancy. But this argument, the first person to occupy a piece of land as its rightful owner, but merely being the first to set foot on, say, Mars, doesn't seem to create a moral claim to the entire planet.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've sort of laid out a really good example of how property rights is a complicated issue. In terms of what is it? How do you adjudicate? How do you determine?
I'm finding it pretty straightforward, man.
Well, but I mean, in this regard, right? Like, well, then how does someone start to claim, the example of the oil field, right? Because like the Mars example, to some extent, okay, yeah, I can see how, let's call it the first owner or the first person to step foot doesn't work. Okay, take the oil field as an example. Well, generally speaking, we're talking like you discover an oil deposit. Well, what happens if two people, let's say 2 kilometers away, find the same oil deposit because it's connected? And so they've both dug wells, they've both mixed their labor, they both discovered it, and they've actually discovered the same oil reserve.
Well, yeah, but I would say, but if they discovered the same oil reserve on separate lands, then they're just pooling from the same resource, no?
Well, you're right, but the argument could be like, well, potentially, do they have to share it 50%? Is it based on who pulls it out of the ground first, right? Like, the point is, to some extent, that the reason I thought oil was really good, because it came up in your example, is that there's still sort of aspects to this that aren't as straightforward once we sort of lay the foundations. And I think it's important just to point out that this is, something that I would argue, and if you look at, North America, Western culture, property rights are so fundamental. And the reason being is, look at it in the respect to, the idea of, storing up your labor in, like, so I built a house on my property, but if all of a sudden it's like, I don't actually own it, and all of a sudden someone could come along and just take that away from me, I would have no incentive to actually build the house.
Right.
So this is where the argument against socialism really comes into play, is that the reason why the West or Western culture has been so successful is because of entrepreneurial spirit and entrepreneurial culture, where people keep the fruits of their entrepreneurial activities, right? And so when I take the risk to mix my labor and put time and effort into something, if it produces a significant gain, I reap that gain. Whereas take the contrast with an employee, the employee doesn't bear any risk. The employee agrees to a contract. I show up, I commit my time to you, and you're going to commit money to me. That employee doesn't have any other risk profile. Their risk is this the right job for me? Is this the wrong job for me? Should I be doing a different job for my career? Is this enough money? Like, they're different risk calculations. It's not the risk of, is this a good decision or a bad decision? If I make the wrong decision, the employee doesn't bear the consequences, other than, the employer may no longer be able to work with them, but there's, the legal ramifications there. And the reason I wanted to bring that up is there's a question about, okay, property rights. Maybe the listener might be like, okay, I realize this is a complicated issue, but that doesn't mean I want to throw complicated. It away. Well, so when I say complicated, I think of the fact that you're going to have disputes that need to be resolved.
Okay, so stop. Let's resolve it. Let's resolve it right now. Whose land is it? Is it Aboriginal land or government land?
Okay, so are you asking what do we do moving forward, or what are you asking me? How is it right now?
No, I'm asking you, like, originally down to the root, in origin.
Well, so this is where I think,
of course, me and you agree. Sorry, I shouldn't set you up like that, because me and you both agree that. Correct me if I'm wrong. Me and you both agree that nobody owns the land. So I'm assuming that the only way we'd know, the only argument we can really come up with how is basically how the land, what's the best way to use the land. And I guess I'm already kind of answering the question that when the British Empire colonizing, their attempt was to, of course, expand their kingdom, and do that by, using the resources to expand their kingdom. And I'm sure, when they came to Canada and they saw the Indigenous people and the way they were using the resources, they're like, we can use it better. And so I would say, of course, by force.
Yes.
Yeah, by force. And I would say, when you look at, many treaties in the Indian Act and the Royal Proclamation of 1763, where the British Empire says, okay, you know what? We are going to acknowledge your land rights. And I think this is important to note, that in the Royal Proclamation of 1763, the British Empire says, okay, we're going to acknowledge Aboriginal land rights. We're going to section off everything west of the Appalachian Mountains. I know we don't have a map, and people are like, Appalachian Mountains? What is he talking about? Well, it's a pretty, basically everything west of the Appalachian Mountains would belong to the Indigenous people, and the American colonizers were kept out and kicked out if they were living on reserve. So now the point I'm making is, now when the British inserts themselves and they're saying, okay, look, we're going to set aside land for you. Now we are the ones who are going to mediate the dealings of how property will be sold and so forth. So we want this land. We want X land. We want this piece of plot of land because, of course, there's great resources, great minerals to advance their cause. So it's okay, look, we're going to compensate you for this, right? So we're going to compensate you for this. We see this in the Robinson Treaty in 1850. We're going to compensate you for this. Here you go. Now, of course, we'll get down later on down the road on what the implications of that were. But the point I'm making is that as the British Empire coming in, they are taking a more, and of course, I don't want to misrepresent any side. I want to try to not straw man any side and speak graciously. But I think that the British Empire was trying to, of course, they thought their way was the best way. And they thought their way of handling the resources was the best way. So I want to quote from the great philosopher Beanie Siegel, circa
way back
1997, and the great Beanie Siegel says, it's either you get down or you get laid down. Those are your options. All right. It's either you get down or you get laid down. So here's what we're going to give you. All right. Cool. All right. Now give us this land, and now
it's a peace treaty.
So basically, what the British Empire is saying, okay, well, we can use this plot of land better than you, so move over.
Yeah. And I mean, I think there's an important thing to point out here. Property rights are a solution to essentially violence, right? Because property rights create a means to adjudicate disputes.
Right. Okay, good.
As opposed to by force.
Right.
Right now, you're sort of laying out the foundation of, and here's where I would say, arguably, they didn't do it well. And that is the concept of, okay, we want this land, we're going to compensate you for it. The part of the predicament is you're trying to set up property rights in a place that doesn't have property rights already. And so, you're, again, let's take the concept of homesteading or other, the Indigenous tribe might say, well, we are located everywhere, right? We just move. We're a mobile people. And so we spent 2 years there 20 years ago. So we own that land too. And so you end up with my point is to say that, or we buried our ancestors there for 50 years, but now we bury them over here. And like, so the point is that I'm just trying to lay out is that they might be, the Indigenous might be claiming, or the Aboriginals might be claiming they own the land based on their concepts.
Yes.
And
yes.
To some extent, you end up with violent conflict, and they're trying to create a resolution to the violent conflict through, the Appalachian Mountains, treaty. you can argue that wasn't good. You could argue that it wasn't fair. But that's not, I don't think that's a fair presentation, because at the same time, you're forgetting that if no treaty was signed, potentially it would have been just warfare till one side was dead and one side was alive.
Yeah, well, you get laid down.
Hindsight's 2020, right? My point is to say we don't know what the best option was. Potentially this option actually was the thing that resulted in the least amount of death.
Please subscribe and hit the bell to stay up to date. If you liked or disliked the snippet, give it a like and share your 2 cents with us in the comment section. And remember, 6 cents makes change.